Welcome to our channel, where history, science, and culture meet to uncover hidden truths. Today we explore Ghanaian DNA, debunking myths and celebrating the authentic story of heritage. From ancient roots to modern genetics, join us as we reveal the vibrant tapestry of Ghana's past, present, and future. Ghanaian DNA, debunking myths and celebrating authentic history through time and science. Part 1. Origins in Deep Time, Early Human Roots in Ghana. From the red soils of West Africa to the lush forests and open savannas of what is today Ghana, the origins of human life in this land reach back into the depths of prehistory, where the story of DNA begins not with kingdoms or clans but with the earliest stirrings of humanity itself, for evidence drawn from archaeological finds and genetic studies points to West Africa as one of the critical cradles of human diversity, a region where ancient populations survived climatic upheavals and preserve lineages that stretch back tens of thousands of years. Scientists studying mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome markers have discovered that populations in West Africa, including those in the Ghanaian region, hold some of the highest levels of genetic variation anywhere on Earth, a sign not of fragmentation but of deep-rooted antiquity. For variation accumulates over long spans of time and indicates that ancestors here were not simply passing through but living, adapting, and thriving in landscapes that offered both opportunity and challenge. The forests provided shelter and resources yet demanded resilience against disease, while the savannas opened pathways for movement and exchange, creating an environment where human groups could remain distinct yet interconnected, their DNA recording the silent story of survival. Paleoanthropologists note that during the great dry phases of the Pleistocene, when deserts expanded and resources dwindled, West Africa became a refuge where populations found ecological niches to persist, meaning that the DNA of today's Ghanaians carries echoes of ancient refugia, a genetic library of resilience in the face of shifting climates. Within these early communities, cultural innovations such as stone tools, the use of fire, and later agriculture began shaping patterns of settlement that would later influence genetic mixing as groups clustered, expanded, or dispersed according to changing needs. Unlike the myths that sometimes claim that African DNA is homogeneous or that Ghanaian groups emerge fully formed only in medieval times, the scientific reality reveals a far deeper time depth, where Ghana's genetic heritage begins with some of the earliest surviving lineages of humankind, a living testament to continuity across millennia. Scholars exploring haplogroups identify lineages such as L1, L2, and L3, which are deeply rooted in West Africa, with L3 in particular being the lineage from which non-African populations later branched during the Great Out-of-Africa Migration, a fact that places Ghanaian DNA not at the margins but at the very heart of humanity's unfolding story. This reality reframes how we view Ghana's past, for instead of treating the land as a recipient of foreign influence, it is clear that it was a source, a region whose people contributed to the genetic fabric of the wider world while simultaneously retaining unique lineages that never left, thus preserving genetic stories that are invisible elsewhere. The terrain itself shaped these outcomes, for rivers like the Volta and the Black Volta carved corridors of movement while also creating boundaries that slowed interaction, meaning that DNA diversity arose not just from external contacts but also from micro-regional adaptations, with some groups evolving immunities to diseases like malaria through genetic traits such as the sickle cell allele, which became widespread because it conferred survival advantages in malaria-heavy zones, embedding in DNA both a marker of struggle and adaptation. Such adaptations remind us that DNA is not merely a record of ancestry but also of lived experiences, of bodies confronting environments, and of populations leaving biological fingerprints of how they overcame recurring challenges. When we trace these threads further back, we find that the DNA preserved in Ghana today links with some of the oldest continuous human groups, bridging between hunter-gatherer ancestors and the agricultural societies that would later dominate the region, meaning that Ghana's genetic story begins not with external arrivals but with enduring presence. This deep-rootedness helps dismantle simplistic narratives that claim Ghanaian identity was imported or shaped solely by later contacts with North Africa or Europe, for while those influences matter in later chapters, the bedrock of Ghanaian DNA predates them by tens of thousands of years. The remarkable thing is that while elsewhere in the world genetic lineages were lost through bottlenecks and migrations, in West Africa diversity was preserved, creating a genetic richness that modern science now uncovers with increasing clarity through genome-wide studies that consistently point to Ghana as a vital reservoir of ancestral variation. Indeed, when researchers compare DNA samples across the continent, They find that the Ghanaian region is home to lineages that remain relatively untouched by later homogenizing waves, showing that isolation at certain times was just as important as interaction, and this balance between preservation and exchange gave rise to the unique genetic tapestry we see today. So when we begin the story of Ghanaian DNA, we must start not with myths of sudden origins or foreign arrivals, but with the profound truth that Ghanaian ancestors were among the earliest keepers of humanity's oldest genetic stories, custodians of lineages that endured climatic storms, environmental pressures, and shifting ecologies. In this light, every modern Ghanaian carries within their cells not just the memory of kingdoms or migrations, but the far older memory of humanity's shared birth, a reminder that Ghana's DNA is not peripheral but foundational, a living bridge between the first humans and the present day, a narrative too often obscured by myths of external creation, yet illuminated by science as a history of resilience, depth, and authenticity. Part 2: Ancient Migrations and the First Settlers. The story of Ghanaian DNA after its deep-time roots unfolds further when we look at the ancient migrations that brought new peoples into the region. For while early inhabitants carried lineages stretching back tens of thousands of years, the land that is now Ghana also became a crossroads where waves of settlers, drawn by fertile soils, rivers, and trade opportunities, introduced fresh layers of genetic diversity. Archaeologists and geneticists together reveal that during the Holocene, roughly 10,000 years ago, climatic shifts transformed landscapes across Africa, shrinking deserts, expanding forests, and opening corridors of movement that encouraged groups to migrate southward from the Sahel and eastward from the forest margins, gradually populating areas that had once been sparse, including the valleys and plateaus of Ghana. These migrations were not mass invasions but steady movements of families and clans, carrying with them distinctive genetic markers that intermingled with those of the older populations already established in the region, leaving signatures that scientists can still trace today. One of the most significant movements into Ghana was linked with the spread of agricultural practices, for as domesticated crops like millet, sorghum, and later yams became central to survival, farming groups moved into regions with fertile land, merging their DNA with hunter-gatherer lineages and establishing the genetic foundations of communities that would later evolve into recognizable ethnic groups. This agricultural revolution was not uniform, however, for the forest zones in southern Ghana favored root crops and oil palm cultivation while the savanna favored cereals and livestock. And these ecological differences encourage varied settlement patterns that in turn shape DNA variation by fostering distinct micropopulations adapted to different subsistence strategies. As early farmers expanded, so too did the exchange of genes, and the arrival of Bantu-speaking migrants from the east added new dimensions to the genetic landscape. For though Ghana sits west of the main Bantu migration corridor, linguistic and genetic evidence suggests that small waves of Bantu-related peoples enter the region, bringing with them not only iron-working skills but also DNA lineages that blended into the Ghanaian genetic pool. Another layer of migration came from the north, where desertification of the Sahara forced communities southward into the Sahel and beyond, carrying with them cattle herding traditions and distinct haplogroups that are still evident in parts of northern Ghana, creating a genetic link between the savanna peoples of Ghana and their Sahelian neighbors. Such north-to-south migrations also explain why many Ghanaian groups today show genetic markers connected to pastoralist communities of the wider West African Sahel, though their DNA remains distinct in important ways, shaped by centuries of intermarriage and adaptation to local environments. These movements highlight how Ghanaian DNA became a palimpsest, with each wave adding a new inscription without erasing the old, a layered text that science can now read more clearly than oral tradition sometimes recalls. But migrations were not only about survival or climate, they were also about opportunity, for the rivers of Ghana, especially the Volta system, offered fertile floodplains that drew settlers, and where settlers gathered, marriages across groups occurred, binding different lineages together and embedding genetic diversity into the social fabric. One striking aspect of these early migrations is how they gave rise to the rich ethnic mosaic that still defines Ghana today. For the Yu, Akan, Ga, Moldagbani, and others all trace their histories back to these formative centuries of movement, their oral traditions often recalling journeys, displacements, and unions that align with the patterns uncovered in genetic research. Though myths sometimes simplify these origins as single founding migrations or the sudden appearance of a people, the genetic evidence tells a more complex story of gradual accumulation, where no group emerged in isolation but rather in interaction, borrowing, merging, and adapting. The early settlers of Ghana thus embody the principle that identity is never static but dynamic. And DNA provides the silent proof, showing how ancient migrations knit together communities that later developed into kingdoms and states. As migrations continued across centuries, Ghana became a cultural frontier where people from multiple directions converge, creating not only shared traditions but also distinctive genetic signatures that separated one group from another. For even as intermarriage occurred, certain lineages persisted within clans, marking boundaries of kinship and inheritance. This dual process of mixing and preservation explains why today Ghanaian DNA shows both high diversity across the population and identifiable links within subgroups, a pattern born from millennia of migration, settlement, and adaptation. Importantly, these migrations also carried with them cultural innovations like pottery styles, iron smelting, and spiritual practices, meaning that DNA was never traveling alone but always intertwined with knowledge, technology, and belief, making the genetic story inseparable from the broader narrative of cultural history. When modern science compares Ghanaian genomes with those of neighboring populations, it finds echoes of these migrations in the shared haplogroups with Nigerians, Ivorians, and Burkinab, yet also notes the uniqueness of Ghanaian DNA, shaped by specific settlement patterns that differed from their neighbors even when their origins overlapped. The result is a genetic heritage that is at once connected and distinctive, rooted in the great migrations that swept across Africa while grounded in the specific ecological and cultural conditions of Ghana itself. These first settlers and migrants laid the foundation for the centuries of complexity to follow, establishing the DNA patterns upon which later episodes of trade, empire, and colonialism would build. And while myths may attempt to reduce these origins to singular tales, the truth revealed in DNA is far richer, reminding us that Ghana's past is written in the journeys of countless ancestors who walked, farmed, fished, and settled across its varied landscapes, leaving their genetic footprints as silent witnesses of resilience and creativity. In understanding these ancient migrations, we move closer to appreciating the authentic depth of Ghanaian DNA, not as a product of external invention but as a living testament to the journeys of peoples who made Ghana their home long before written history began. Part 3. Ethnic Mosaic, the birth of distinct Ghanaian groups. As migrations layered upon ancient roots, the land that is today Ghana transformed into a vibrant mosaic of peoples, each community carrying strands of DNA shaped by unique journeys yet bound together by shared geography, and over centuries these groups crystallized into distinct ethnic identities whose differences and commonalities can still be read in both culture and genetic markers. Among the most prominent were the Akan, who gradually spread across the forest zones of central and southern Ghana, their DNA reflecting a blend of indigenous hunter-gatherer ancestry with lineages drawn from agricultural and ironworking migrants who had moved in from the Sahel in the east, and oral traditions that speak of Akan journeys align with genetic traces showing multiple points of origin, not a single founding source. The U, concentrated in the eastern regions, trace their heritage through oral histories of migration from areas east of the Volta River, and genetic evidence supports these accounts by revealing affinities with populations in Togo and Benin, yet within Ghana the UDNA also bears signs of intermixing with local lineages, showing how identities once formed through mobility stabilized into long-lasting communities. The Ga and Adangbe peoples, who established themselves along the coast, exemplify another strand of the mosaic, their DNA carrying imprints of contact with both inland groups and seafaring visitors, for coastal living opened them to exchanges not only with other Ghanaians but eventually with wider Atlantic networks, though their earliest distinctiveness was forged in interactions along the Gulf of Guinea. In the north, the Mole Dagbani emerged as a constellation of peoples whose DNA shows strong ties to Sahelian migrants and pastoralist lineages, a reflection of centuries of movement southward from arid lands where survival demanded mobility. And the persistence of these northern lineages illustrates how Ghana's savanna served as a genetic and cultural bridge between Sahel and forest. These identities were never fixed at birth but evolved as clans merged, languages spread, and social structures coalesced, yet DNA preserves evidence of continuity beneath the fluidity, for even as groups adopted new cultural traits, certain genetic signatures endured, linking modern communities to ancient settlers. The ethnic mosaic was also enriched by smaller groups such as the Gwan, considered by many traditions as among the earliest inhabitants of Ghana, and genetic studies support this view by identifying lineages in Gwan populations that are older and less mixed than those of late arriving groups, suggesting a continuity of presence even as larger communities like the Akan and U rose to prominence. In this way, the Ghanaian mosaic is not simply a patchwork of equal pieces but a layered tapestry, where some groups preserve ancient threads while others represent newer weaves, and the interplay of old and new creates the unique diversity visible today. Genetic markers reveal that although these groups differ in language and tradition, their DNA overlaps extensively, showing that intermarriage and exchange were common, a reminder that boundaries of ethnicity were porous, and alliances between communities often cemented through kinship. Such blending explains why Ghanaian DNA cannot be reduced to isolated compartments. Rather, it is a spectrum where distinctions exist, but do not preclude connections, a truth sometimes obscured by myths that treat ethnic groups as ancient and unchanging when in fact they were products of long processes of fusion and adaptation. The creation of distinct ethnic groups was also tied to geography, for the forest belt nurtured societies that relied heavily on farming and trade in kola nuts and gold, while the savanna fostered communities oriented toward herding and grain cultivation, and these economic differences reinforced genetic clustering as marriage often followed ecological and occupational lines. Yet moments of interaction, whether through trade routes, shared festivals, or military alliances, continually reshape the mosaic, weaving DNA from one group into another in subtle ways that science can now detect. The diversity of Ghanaian groups challenges myths of uniform ancestry, for no single lineage defines the nation, and the multiplicity itself is the strength, producing resilience through genetic variety that allowed adaptation to diseases, climates, and external pressures. Genetic studies comparing Akan, Ga, and Moldagbani groups reveal both their distinct haplogroup frequencies and their shared ancestry, showing that differences are matters of emphasis, not absolute separation, and that the Ghanaian mosaic is better understood as a spectrum of overlapping identities. The emergence of these groups also laid the foundation for political and cultural developments, for the distinctiveness of Akan or lineages underpinned oral traditions of origin, which in turn legitimized authority and kingship, tying DNA and culture together in ways that shape governance. DNA alone cannot explain the full story, but when paired with oral histories and archaeology, it shows how distinct groups arose not from isolation but from centuries of dialogue between peoples, producing the mosaic that would later sustain great kingdoms. Each ethnic group thus represents not just a cultural identity but a genetic archive, preserving within its lineages the journeys, unions, and adaptations that brought it into being, and together these archives create the wider Ghanaian story, a narrative richer and more diverse than any single myth of origin could capture. When we examine this mosaic through modern genetics, we see not just separation but interconnectedness, and we are reminded that what makes Ghana unique is not a single root but a forest of roots intertwining beneath the soil of history, feeding into a shared trunk while retaining individual strands. In this way, the birth of Ghana's ethnic groups stands as a defining chapter in the DNA story, showing how diversity was forged not by outside imposition but by the lived experiences of ancestors who settled, mixed, and built communities across the varied landscapes of this land. Part 4. River Valleys and Genetic Exchange. If the ethnic mosaic gave Ghana its recognizable human form, it was the river valleys that nourished the lifeblood of genetic exchange, for rivers not only watered crops and sustained fishing but also created pathways of movement where peoples met, mingled, and intermarried, leaving enduring imprints in DNA that reveal how landscapes guided the flow of ancestry. The Volta River system, with its Black Volta, White Volta, and Oti tributaries, carved natural corridors across northern and central Ghana, enabling savanna communities to link with forest dwellers, and as these groups exchanged goods, marriages often followed, producing genetic signatures that blur sharp divides between north and south. The Pra, Ankobra, and Taino rivers in the south likewise shaped patterns of settlement and interaction, for their fertile valleys drew farmers and traders, while their navigability allowed goods and ideas to move between interior and coast, carrying with them the genes of those who traveled along their banks. DNA evidence shows that regions along these river valleys often display higher levels of diversity than isolated highlands or deep forest interiors, a direct reflection of their role as crossroads where strangers became kin and lineages intertwined. Oral traditions, though told in mythic form, preserve echoes of this reality, with many groups recounting stories of ancestors following rivers to new homelands, an allegory for the migrations that geneticists can now trace through haplogroups and genome-wide studies. The role of rivers in genetic exchange becomes especially clear when we consider how malaria shaped human survival, for the swampy banks of rivers were breeding grounds for mosquitoes, and communities that lived near them often developed and spread genetic adaptations like the sickle cell trait, embedding environmental pressures into DNA in a way that linked health, geography, and ancestry. These adaptations did not remain confined but spread through intermarriage across river-based communities, ensuring that the biological lessons of one group became shared tools of resilience for others. In this way, the rivers function not just as physical channels of water but as invisible conduits of genetic and cultural knowledge. Their meandering course is mirrored in the intertwining of bloodlines. Along the coastal rivers, where the Pra and Ankobro emptied into the Atlantic, fishing communities developed that were in constant contact with inland farmers, and genetic evidence suggests a steady blending between these groups long before external traders ever arrived, showing that Ghanaian DNA diversity is as much a product of internal exchange as it is of later external influence. In northern Ghana, the Volta Basin linked Moldagbani peoples to neighboring groups in present-day Burkina Faso and beyond, creating a northward web of kinship, while in the forested middle belt the Ofin and Birim rivers sustained gold mining communities whose prosperity drew migrants from multiple directions, embedding economic attraction into the genetic story. These dynamics also explain why no ethnic group in Ghana today carries a completely isolated lineage, for the rivers dissolve hard boundaries and created shared ancestries even while allowing distinctive cultural identities to remain. Geneticists comparing populations along different rivers find subtle but important variations, with certain haplogroups more common near one valley than another, reflecting both the localized settlement of clans and the gradual blending with neighbors, a balance between uniqueness and exchange that defines Ghanaian DNA. The river valleys also acted as stages for cultural rituals tied to fertility, harvest, and spiritual guardianship, and such gatherings often became occasions for intermarriage between clans, further intertwining genetic lineages in ways that oral history encodes through references to river deities and ancestral bonds. Myths sometimes portray these unions as divinely ordained, yet science reveals their tangible outcome in the genetic record, showing that the sanctity of rivers was also the sanctity of shared heritage. The importance of rivers in genetic history can also be seen in how trade routes followed their courses, for goods moved more easily along waterways, and where traders traveled, families were formed, producing descendants who embodied the meeting of different ancestries. In this way, rivers became bridges not only for gold and cola but for DNA itself, carrying human stories across distances that would otherwise have divided them. The DNA of communities settled far from river valleys, such as those in mountainous or heavily forested zones, often shows less diversity and more continuity, reflecting isolation, while those in riverine corridors display broader variation, a pattern that underscores the role of rivers as engines of genetic exchange. Yet despite these interactions, the rivers also allowed groups to maintain local distinctiveness, for while they enabled contact, they also defined territories, and in some cases communities saw rivers as natural boundaries, leading to subtle differences in lineage frequencies between those on opposite banks. This interplay of connection and division mirrors the larger Ghanaian story, where diversity was fostered through movement but identities were also preserved through attachment to land. Today, when scientists analyze DNA samples across Ghana, they can still detect these ancient riverine influences, with clusters of genetic similarity aligning with historical river valleys, a reminder that geography leaves its mark not just on culture but on biology itself. The river valleys, then, were more than landscapes. They were living participants in the shaping of Ghanaian DNA, shaping who met whom, who married whom, and whose children carried forward the blend of ancestries that became the Ghanaian genetic tapestry. In recognizing their role, we see that the history of DNA is inseparable from the environment, and that the waters that sustained crops and quenched thirst also sustained the flow of genes, creating a legacy of diversity that endures to this day. Part 5. The role of trade in shaping DNA diversity. Long before ships from Europe appeared on the Atlantic horizon, the peoples of Ghana were already deeply connected by webs of trade that stretched across forests, savannas, and deserts, and these exchanges did more than move goods like cola, salt, and gold. They moved people, families, and bloodlines, shaping the DNA of Ghana in ways that reflected centuries of interaction and adaptation. Trade created constant opportunities for contact between groups that otherwise might have remained separated by geography. For the cola nut trade linked the forest zones of southern Ghana to the arid Sahel, while gold mining drew migrants into central Ghana from multiple directions, ensuring that economic opportunity always carried a genetic consequence. Along trade paths, marriages were common, for merchants often settled in foreign markets, taking wives and raising children whose DNA blended different ancestries. And over generations, these unions forged kinship networks that spanned regions, blurring rigid ethnic divides while still maintaining cultural distinctions. Archaeology confirms that bustling market towns like Bago and Bonomanso thrived as crossroads of commerce, and genetic evidence supports the idea that these hubs were also crossroads of ancestry, with higher levels of genetic diversity found near such ancient trade centers. The movement of salt from the Sahara into Ghana illustrates how trade embedded genetics into economic patterns for northern. Caravans brought not only mineral wealth but also Sahelian bloodlines into contact with Akan and Moldagbani communities, leaving descendants who carried the story of exchange in their DNA. Similarly, the southward flow of kola nuts drew northern migrants into the forest, where they intermarried with local populations, embedding northern lineages into southern genomes. A pattern still detectable in genetic studies that show affinities between certain southern groups and their Sahelian neighbors. Gold, the most famous of Ghana's resources, also had genetic implications, for mining settlements attracted not only Ghanaians but also migrants from neighboring regions such as Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso, whose DNA entered the Ghanaian pool through generations of miners who became permanent residents. The interconnectedness of trade and DNA becomes clearer when we consider that trade routes were not just roads of goods but arteries of human life, and wherever goods traveled, genes traveled too, for each merchant who moved, married, and settled passed on lineages that might never have crossed paths otherwise. These exchanges helped to produce a remarkable level of genetic resilience, for diversity offered advantages in adapting to disease and environmental challenges, meaning that trade not only enriched economies but also strengthened biological survival. Myths sometimes frame Ghana's genetic diversity as a result of foreign intrusion, but the reality is that long before outside powers arrived, Ghana's DNA had already been richly layered through centuries of internal and regional trade. The role of women in this process was pivotal, for women were not only producers and traders but also the anchors of family lines, and many oral traditions record that marriages forged through trade cemented alliances between clans, making women central to the genetic blending that trade encouraged. Language, too, reflects this heritage, for the spread of Akan dialects across trade zones parallels genetic mixing, suggesting that commerce was both a cultural and biological exchange, embedding identity into the flows of goods. DNA studies comparing communities along trade corridors with those in more isolated regions show consistently greater variation where commerce thrived, confirming that the flow of wealth and genes went hand in hand. The great trans-Saharan trade routes, reaching from North Africa into the Sahel, also left faint but detectable imprints in Ghanaian DNA. For though Ghana was geographically distant from the desert edge, its markets were fed by caravans that brought with them traders of mixed Berber and Arab ancestry, and in the course of generations some of these outsiders settled permanently, leaving descendants whose genetic heritage contributed to Ghana's diversity. Yet the impact of these exchanges was never overwhelming, for Ghanaian DNA remained rooted in West African lineages, showing that, while foreign contacts occurred, they were absorbed into a much larger local matrix, their presence enriching rather than erasing Ghana's genetic identity. This balanced outcome illustrates the difference between myth and science, for while myths may exaggerate the role of outsiders, genetic evidence reveals that Ghana's diversity was primarily the result of internal African exchange amplified by trade, with external influences adding only subtle layers. These dynamics also explain why Ghanaian DNA today is both distinct and cosmopolitan, carrying the signatures of regional interactions while maintaining a clear West African identity that cannot be mistaken for any other. Trade thus emerges as a powerful engine not only of wealth but of biological heritage, reminding us that every market transaction carried within it the possibility of a new family, a new lineage, a new genetic contribution to Ghana's mosaic. When we look at Ghanaian DNA through the lens of trade, we see how economies and ancestries co-developed, and we understand that the richness of Ghana's past is written not only in gold weights and kola sacks but in the chromosomes of its people, who embody centuries of exchange as surely as they embody centuries of survival. In this way, trade stands as a vital chapter in the authentic history of Ghanaian DNA, a chapter where rivers of commerce became rivers of ancestry, and where the goods that sustained kingdoms also carried the invisible wealth of genetic diversity. Part 6. Gold, Salt, and the Flow of Peoples. The magnetic pull of gold and salt transformed the Ghanaian landscape into a nexus of human movement, for these two commodities not only shaped economies but also carried immense influence over the genetic map of the region, drawing peoples into contact, forging unions, and weaving new lineages into the Ghanaian DNA tapestry. Gold, found in abundance in the forest zones and riverbeds of central and southern Ghana, was the shining lure that brought distant traders into its orbit, and where trade routes opened, people followed, often settling, marrying, and embedding their ancestry into local communities, creating clusters of genetic diversity around mining and trading hubs. Salt, though less glamorous than gold, was equally essential, for it preserved food, sustained caravans, and nourished livestock, making it a lifeline commodity that traveled southward from the Sahara in great caravans, carrying with it merchants whose DNA would mingle with those of Ghanaian families along the way. The trade in gold and salt thus set in motion patterns of human mobility that reshaped local populations, for northern merchants entering the Akan forest towns or Mole Dagbani markets were not only economic actors but biological participants, leaving descendants who embodied the invisible legacy of commerce. Oral traditions that speak of alliances between kings and northern traders are mirrored in genetic evidence that reveals traces of Sahelian lineages within Ghanaian DNA. Subtle but enduring marks of generations of intermarriage. Gold mining settlements like those in the Akan forest became melting pots where people of diverse backgrounds converge, not just to seek fortune but to build communities, and the DNA preserved in their descendants reflects that complexity, showing markers that link them to populations far beyond their immediate homelands. Salt, meanwhile, bound Ghana to the greater Sahelian world, for caravans arriving with slabs of desert salt did not depart empty. They carried back not only gold but also stories, spouses, and children, creating bidirectional flows of genes as well as goods. The dual trade in gold and salt demonstrates how the most basic necessities and the most coveted luxuries together served as engines of genetic mixing, reinforcing that DNA history is inseparable from material history. Genetic studies highlight that while Ghanaian DNA remains overwhelmingly West African in its core, the Sahelian contributions are evident in northern populations and, through the corridors of trade, in parts of the south as well, producing patterns of variation that align closely with ancient trade routes. These influences were not overwhelming enough to displace local lineages but rather folded into them, enriching diversity without erasing distinctiveness, which is why Ghanaian DNA today shows both deep continuity and subtle evidence of external threads. Myths sometimes portray gold as a curse that invited exploitation from outsiders, yet before external powers arrive, gold had already acted as a magnet that encouraged integration between different African communities, knitting together ancestries through commerce-driven marriages. Similarly, salt is remembered mostly as a commodity, but DNA shows it was also a vehicle of human connection. For merchants who carried salt often left behind children whose descendants still live in Ghana today. This pattern of commodity-driven migration explains why certain regions near goldfields or salt markets display higher genetic variation, as they became points of convergence for different populations. In cultural terms, these flows of people were often sanctified by rituals that acknowledged the sacredness of exchange, whether in the Akan gold weights used to measure value or the Sahelian traditions tied to salt caravans. And such rituals reinforced alliances that went beyond trade into kinship, ensuring that genetic exchange was sustained over generations. DNA reveals that these unions were not random but often strategic, for marriages linked trading clans and secure commercial trust, binding families across distances that otherwise might have been divided by language or geography. In this way, the very success of Ghana's pre-colonial trade economy was underwritten by the circulation of genes as much as goods, with descendants today carrying within their DNA the proof of how deeply trade shaped their heritage. The richness of Ghana's genetic story thus owes much to the twin forces of gold and salt, commodities that, though materially opposite, one glittering and symbolic of wealth, the other plain and essential to survival, together sustain movements that forever alter the human map of the region. To this day, the echoes of these exchanges remain visible not only in the genetic record but in cultural practices that reflect blended traditions, showing that the flow of people sparked by gold and salt was not a fleeting episode but a long-lasting current in Ghana's history. When modern scientists trace haplogroups across West Africa, they find lineages that spread precisely along the same routes once used for salt caravans and gold markets, confirming that what oral histories recount and what archaeology uncovers are also inscribed in DNA, the most intimate record of the past. Thus, the story of gold and salt is not only about riches and survival but about ancestry. For every ingot mined and every block traded carried with it the possibility of human connection, and in those connections lay the making of the Ghanaian DNA mosaic that endures today. Part 7. The Rise of Kingdoms and Intermarriages. The emergence of centralized kingdoms across Ghanaian lands reshaped not only the political and cultural landscapes but also the very bloodlines of their people, for power in pre-colonial Africa was rarely secured by conquest alone and more often consolidated through strategic marriages that wove together families, clans, and even ethnic groups into enduring lineages that today still echo in Ghanaian DNA. The rise of kingdoms such as the Akan polities in the forest zones, the Moldagbani states in the north, and the Garadangbe chieftaincies along the coast brought with them new opportunities for intermarriage, as rulers sought to legitimize authority by forging alliances across linguistic and cultural divides, thereby embedding political strategy into the biological record. Kings and chiefs often married women from neighboring groups not only to strengthen ties but also to ensure peace, and these unions carried long-term genetic consequences as their offspring inherited mixed ancestries that reflected the merging of multiple traditions. Oral traditions remember such marriages as pivotal events, recounting how a princess from one kingdom would become queen in another, cementing bonds between peoples. Yet modern DNA analysis confirms these stories by showing genetic overlaps in populations that had once been politically distinct. The Akan kingdoms, with their matrilineal inheritance system, played a particularly unique role in shaping DNA for maternal lines carried political legitimacy, and thus royal marriages brought into the fold women from far-reaching regions, embedding their mitochondrial DNA within ruling houses and, by extension, within wider populations. In contrast, the patrilineal traditions of northern Ghana's Moldagbani states emphasized paternal descent, yet even their royal unions were carefully curated to extend influence and bridge divides, and the resulting Y chromosome markers demonstrate links across areas once separated by great distance. These intermarriages also served to integrate populations into the identities of rising kingdoms, so that clans who might once have been outsiders became insiders through kinship, their bloodlines woven into the political tapestry that held kingdoms together. As kingdoms grew wealthier through trade, the stakes of dynastic marriage only increased, and so too did the scope of genetic exchange. For a ruler who secured goldfields through marriage or access to salt through kinship was also securing lineages that would forever leave their imprint in Ghanaian DNA. In times of conflict, marriages acted as peace treaties, but in times of expansion they were used to legitimize authority over conquered territories, ensuring that the ruler was not an alien overlord but a relative, a kin-bound leader whose children carried the heritage of both conqueror and conquered. This blending explains why Ghana's genetic map does not follow rigid ethnic lines but shows overlaps and shared markers, as centuries of intermarriage blurred what might otherwise have been stark divides. Myths of pure bloodlines often dissolve under the weight of these facts, for the very concept of purity is contradicted by the deliberate and sustained practice of rulers seeking spouses from diverse backgrounds in order to strengthen their thrones. Such practices also affected commoners, for when elites modeled intermarriage as a political necessity, broader populations often followed suit, normalizing unions across ethnic or linguistic boundaries, a process that amplified genetic diversity over generations. Ceremonies surrounding these marriages were more than personal unions. They were public spectacles that signified the joining of peoples, and the descendants of such unions carried within them the memory of these alliances, even when the political landscapes that had inspired them shifted or collapsed. Genetic studies show that areas corresponding to former royal capitals often display higher than average genetic variation, reflecting their status as centers where diverse lineages converge through both political marriages and ordinary settlement. This is especially visible in Akan regions, where the rise of powerful kingdoms like Denkyera and later Asante created dynastic networks that drew in spouses from across the region, leaving a genetic record of interconnectedness that belies modern boundaries. Northern states likewise display evidence of integration, with Moldagbani royal traditions incorporating elements from neighboring groups and embedding those relationships in both cultural practice and DNA. Thus, the very structure of Ghanaian society in its pre-colonial kingdoms made intermarriage not a byproduct but a deliberate strategy of governance, demonstrating how the history of power is inseparable from the history of genes. As generations passed, the descendants of these unions often rose to new positions of influence, carrying with them composite ancestries that became symbols of legitimacy, showing that Ghana's kingdoms were never built upon isolation but upon the careful weaving together of people into shared lineages. The rise of kingdoms was therefore not just a political story but a genetic one, for behind every throne stood a web of marriages that stretched across communities, producing descendants whose DNA carries the unbroken testimony of how kingdoms rose and endured. In celebrating Ghanaian history, One must see in its DNA the legacies of these royal unions, for the intermarriages that once bound kingdoms together also bound the nation's genetic heritage into the rich, authentic mosaic it represents today. Part 8. The Trans-Saharan Link, Genes on the Caravan Routes. The caravans that threaded across the Sahara were more than just lifelines of commerce. They were moving communities that carried not only gold, salt, and ideas, but also bloodlines that would subtly shape Ghanaian DNA. For as camel trains crossed from North Africa into the Sahel and toward the forests of West Africa, the merchants, guards, servants, and pilgrims who traveled with them left behind descendants, embedding traces of trans-Saharan connections into the genetic fabric of Ghana. The Sahara, often imagined as a barrier, was in fact a bridge that facilitated centuries of human movement, and while most Ghanaian DNA remains rooted in local West African lineages, genetic studies reveal minor but distinct markers that point to ancient contact with Berber, Tuareg, and even Arab populations, evidence of caravan traffic that linked Ghana to distant lands. Salt caravans in particular served as arteries of exchange, for each journey was long and perilous, often requiring extended stays at southern trading towns, and in these settlements merchants took wives, formed unions, and created mixed descendants whose DNA bore both Sahelian and local signatures. The gold trade also drew northern partners deep into the Akan forest, where intermarriage became a political and economic strategy, and while the Akan core genetic heritage remained distinct, subtle signals of North African-related ancestry confirm that the caravans were more than transient presences. Islam, carried along with the traders, reinforced these connections, for as mosques were built in northern Ghana and Quranic schools taught new generations, families intermarried with Muslim scholars and merchants, their children carrying both cultural and biological legacies. This explains why mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome studies sometimes show faint northern influences, not overwhelming but consistent with centuries of caravan movement, or oral histories of towns like Salaga, Yendi, and Gambega. Remember their role as caravan hubs, and genetic research aligns with these accounts, showing diversity peaks in precisely the places where trans-Saharan routes terminated. The genetic contribution of caravan routes was not uniform. It was stronger in the north, where daily contact with traders was most intense, and weaker in the south, where northern partners often acted as intermediaries. But even there, the effects can still be traced. The cultural consequences of these unions were equally profound. For children of caravan marriages often inherited bilingualism, Islamic learning, and commercial networks, advantages that helped them rise as intermediaries between kingdoms, cementing a connection between mobility and power. Genetic diversity created by the caravans also challenged notions of rigid ethnic boundaries, for in caravan towns lineages blended as Hausa, Tuareg, Berber, and local peoples shared ancestry, producing descendants whose identities straddled categories. Sometimes the integration was so complete that northern lineages were absorbed fully into local clans, their genetic legacy persisting even when cultural markers faded, showing how DNA retains memories that oral traditions may have forgotten. Myths of Ghana as isolated are contradicted by this record, for while the Sahara was harsh, it was not impassable. And Ghanaian DNA shows that long before European contact, Ghanaians were already linked to a broader Afro-Eurasian world. Through the arteries of caravan trade, the movement of enslaved people also played a role, for caravans carried captives northward as well as goods southward, and some of these captives returned or were integrated into new communities in Ghana, leaving complex patterns of ancestry that defy simple explanations. Genetic traces of such movements show up as minor signals of Saharan and even Mediterranean ancestry, faint but undeniable, a testament to the human costs of trade. Yet it is important to note that these contributions never overwhelmed Ghanaian DNA, rather, they layered onto an already rich West African core, adding nuance without erasing identity. Caravan marriages also reinforced kinship diplomacy, for alliances sealed through blood created long-term trust in trade, ensuring caravans would continue to return and that markets would flourish under protection of kin ties. DNA records show that while Ghanaian populations today remain firmly West African, the faint signals of North African, Berber, and Arab ancestry are more than genetic curiosities. They are evidence of centuries of exchange, partnership, and adaptation, woven into the story of survival in one of the most challenging landscapes on Earth. Thus, the Trans-Saharan link is not simply an economic story but a human one, for every caravan that arrived carried the possibility of new unions, new descendants, and new threads in the genetic tapestry of Ghana, creating a bridge between the savannah and the desert, between the forest and the Mediterranean world. Part 9. The Atlantic Era, Forced Migrations and DNA Scars. The arrival of European ships on the Gulf of Guinea coastline marked one of the most devastating turning points in Ghana's genetic history, for the Atlantic slave trade tore millions of lives from their communities, scattering Ghanaian DNA across oceans, embedding it into the Americas, the Caribbean, and beyond, while simultaneously leaving scars within the homeland as entire regions were depopulated, kinship lines were severed, and demographic balances were violently reshaped. The forts and castles along the coast, such as Elmina, Cape Coast, and Christiansborg, became gateways of human tragedy, where countless men, women, and children passed through the door of no return, carrying with them lineages that would survive in diaspora populations but vanish from the soil that birthed them, creating a haunting absence in the Ghanaian genetic record. Yet even within Ghana, the trade altered DNA patterns, for communities under pressure often relocated, merged, or intermarried for survival, producing new mixtures that were born of necessity rather than choice. Raiding, warfare, and alliances formed around the trade meant that entire clans were fractured, with some branches carried away and others remaining, leaving genetic cousins separated by oceans but linked by bloodlines. Genetic studies in the Americas and the Caribbean consistently identify Ghanaian markers, especially from Akan, Ga, and U populations, confirming that Ghanaian DNA became deeply embedded in African diaspora identities, yet these same studies highlight gaps in Ghana itself where those lineages were removed, scars in the local DNA map that reflect the human drain of the Atlantic era. Coastal communities were most vulnerable, and the resulting intermarriages between Europeans, coastal elites, and enslaved women also introduced small but noticeable European genetic contributions into Ghanaian populations, particularly around trading posts, creating lineages that bore the complex imprint of coercion, exploitation, and survival. The trauma of forced migrations is therefore written into DNA both by what is present and by what is missing, for mitochondrial and Y chromosome studies show absences of certain lineages that would have been more common had millions not been taken, while diaspora populations show higher frequencies of precisely those same lineages. The Atlantic slave trade thus bifurcated Ghanaian DNA into two worlds, one carried across oceans, where it mixed with European and indigenous American ancestries to form new identities, and another left behind, struggling to rebuild itself amid loss. Oral traditions in Ghana speak of villages depopulated overnight, of mothers mourning children never returned, and while memory often fades with time, DNA remembers, for its patterns preserve the distortions of demographic collapse. In some regions, the trade accelerated intermarriage as smaller groups sought survival by merging with larger communities, leaving traces of genetic integration that otherwise might not have occurred so quickly. At the same time, new identities arose along the coast as people of mixed descent formed intermediary communities, bridging African and European heritage, and though their numbers were small compared to the overall population, their descendants remain living evidence of how violence and intimacy coexisted during this dark chapter. The Atlantic connection also introduced diseases, famine, and warfare that further shifted population structures, amplifying genetic bottlenecks as communities shrank and survivors' lineages became disproportionately represented in future generations. Even today, geneticists can trace the echoes of these bottlenecks, finding evidence of reduced diversity in certain areas that aligns with historical accounts of slave raiding and depopulation. Yet within this tragedy lies resilience, for Ghanaian DNA persisted across oceans, surviving in the genomes of millions of descendants in Jamaica, Haiti, Brazil, Suriname, and the United States, testifying that while bodies were uprooted, identities endured. Modern DNA testing has allowed African Americans and Caribbean descendants to reconnect with Ghanaian lineages, closing circles of memory that were once violently broken, and in doing so, it has revealed how far Ghanaian ancestry traveled and how deeply it took root abroad. This exchange is not only genetic but cultural, for diaspora communities maintained Akan day names, U drumming patterns, and Ga rituals that, alongside DNA, anchor their identities in Ghana, demonstrating that the forced migration scattered heritage without erasing it. The scars of the Atlantic era therefore run both ways. Ghana's homeland DNA carries gaps and traces of European intrusion, while diaspora DNA carries mixtures born of survival and adaptation, together forming a mirror of loss and resilience. The Atlantic slave trade, in its brutal scope, thus left a genetic legacy that cannot be measured only in numbers taken but in the altered course of entire lineages, the silences in family trees, and the dispersed kin who today can rediscover one another through science. Ghanaian DNA, fractured by this epoch, nonetheless remains whole in its authenticity, for even the scars are part of its truth. A reminder that history leaves no body untouched and that in every cell lies testimony to both suffering and survival. Part 10. Survival, Adaptation, and Cultural Memory. The centuries of forced migration, warfare, and demographic disruption left deep wounds upon Ghana, yet survival itself became a form of resistance, and adaptation ensured that Ghanaian DNA retained its authenticity even as communities reshaped themselves, for when villages were destroyed and kin torn apart, the survivors forged new bonds through marriage, migration, and cultural continuity, embedding resilience into both their bloodlines and their traditions. In regions most affected by the Atlantic trade, smaller groups often merged into larger ones, creating genetic blending that not only preserved their existence but also expanded the diversity of local populations, so that what might have been extinction instead became absorption, and DNA today records these acts of survival as lineages intertwined rather than erased. Adaptation was not only genetic but cultural, for even as people were lost, traditions carried forward through language, ritual, and memory anchored communities to their past, ensuring that identity could be rebuilt upon what remained, and in this way Ghanaian heritage endured despite centuries of rupture. Intermarriage across ethnic lines accelerated during this era, driven by necessity rather than politics alone, as displaced families sought protection and stability by uniting with others, creating descendants who embodied multiple ancestries and who carried within them the story of communities refusing to vanish. Oral traditions. Remember this time as one of mourning but also renewal, telling of how rituals were adapted to honor both lost kin and new unions, blending customs into hybrid practices that mirrored the genetic blending occurring in the people themselves. DNA evidence shows that while diversity narrowed in some regions due to population collapse, other areas experienced surges of variation as displaced groups settled in new territories, reinforcing that survival was uneven but never absent. Cultural memory functioned as a protective thread across these shifts, for names, stories, and proverbs preserved ancestral identity even when bloodlines were fractured, and these intangible legacies worked alongside biological survival to maintain continuity. One can see this resilience in the persistence of day-naming traditions among the Akan, the continuity of ancestral shrines among the Yu, and the endurance of communal rites among the Ga, all of which remained intact even as the genetic landscape shifted. Adaptation also meant economic reinvention, as communities deprived of coastal autonomy moved inland, rebuilding trade networks and sustaining themselves through agriculture and craft, and these movements brought new waves of intermarriage and kinship exchange, deepening the complexity of DNA patterns. Myths of cultural collapse are therefore misleading, for though trauma was immense, Ghanaian DNA demonstrates not disappearance but transformation, where surviving groups remade themselves in forms strong enough to carry forward into the present. The genetic record of this period is one of uneven scars, yet it also reveals continuity, for many lineages trace back unbroken despite centuries of upheaval, showing that survival was as much about holding on as it was about adapting. Cultural memory worked in tandem with biology to ensure this endurance, as songs, folktales, and oral genealogies reminded descendants of their origins even when family trees had gaps, and this remembering anchored identity across generations. The adaptive strategies of this time also reshaped gender roles in lineage building, for women often became the bearers of continuity, marrying into new groups and transmitting both mitochondrial DNA and cultural traditions to their children, making maternal lines central to survival. Genetic studies confirm this, showing remarkable continuity in maternal haplogroups across centuries, suggesting that even as paternal lines were fractured by war and enslavement, maternal lines often preserved the thread of heritage. Adaptation also fostered creativity, as hybrid identities emerged, blending Akan, Ga, Yu, and Mole Dagbani elements into new cultural forms that mirrored the genetic blending within their descendants, leaving a legacy of diversity that still defines Ghana today. In this way, survival was not passive but active, a deliberate choice to rebuild in the face of devastation, and DNA preserves that choice in the continuity of lineages that might otherwise have been extinguished. The scars of loss remain visible, yet they coexist with evidence of resilience, making Ghanaian DNA a story not only of rupture but of rebirth, where cultural memory acted as a compass guiding communities through trauma and adaptation ensured their survival in body and in spirit. Thus, the aftermath of the Atlantic era was not the end but the beginning of a new phase in Ghanaian history, where the Persistence of identity against all odds became its greatest triumph, and this triumph is inscribed in the genes of every Ghanaian today, a living record of survival against history's greatest storm. Part 11. Myths of pure lineages debunked. The idea of pure, untouched bloodlines often arises in discussions of heritage, yet Ghanaian DNA tells a far more complex and truthful story, one that reveals centuries of integration, adaptation, and blending rather than isolation, for purity is not only a myth but a contradiction to the very nature of human history. And in Ghana, this myth dissolves under the weight of genetic evidence that highlights how every major period of the past contributed threads to the present mosaic. The Akan, Ga, Moldagbani, and countless other groups are sometimes spoken of as if they were timeless, fixed, and biologically distinct. Yet DNA studies show overlapping lineages and shared markers that point to centuries of intermarriage, migration, and alliance, proving that identities were never frozen in isolation but always shaped by contact with others. Myths of purity often emerge in nationalist or cultural pride, where communities imagine themselves as direct, unbroken descendants of ancient ancestors, but the genetic record reveals that while continuity is strong, it is accompanied by traces of exchange, integration, and change, all of which contradict the notion of purity without diminishing authenticity. For example, mitochondrial DNA shows continuity of maternal lines that stretch back thousands of years, yet alongside these unbroken threads appear haplogroups that entered through trade, marriage, and migration, reminding us that continuity and diversity coexist rather than exclude each other. Purity myths also ignore the role of intermarriage among rulers and commoners alike, for kingdoms deliberately used unions to forge alliances, and caravan routes as well as Atlantic disruptions added further threads, ensuring that Ghanaian DNA reflects a shared human story rather than an isolated one. Oral traditions themselves sometimes complicate purity myths, for many acknowledge that founding ancestors came from other regions, whether migrating from the Sahel, crossing rivers, or arriving with caravans, stories that align with genetic evidence of mixed origins and layered ancestries. DNA also shows that even so-called homogeneous groups carry internal diversity, with genetic variation between clans often as significant as between neighboring ethnicities, a reminder that the idea of a single, pure lineage is biologically untenable. Myths of purity sometimes serve to exclude, yet Ghanaian DNA reminds us that identity is built from connection. For what makes the heritage authentic is not an absence of mixing but the way diverse threads have been woven into a resilient and enduring whole. The Atlantic era further shatters purity myths, for forced migration scattered Ghanaian lineages abroad while introducing European traces into the coastal gene pool, a reminder that history leaves no lineage untouched, even when myths imagine otherwise. Colonial rule too introduced new interactions, from mixed families near forts and trading posts to unions formed under coercion or adaptation, all of which added complexity to the genetic record and eroded any possibility of pure lines. Modern genetic science highlights that all human populations, not only in Ghana but worldwide, carry evidence of ancient mixing, and in Ghana this truth resonates with particular clarity because of its position at crossroads of trade, migration, and empire, where no community could remain isolated indefinitely. Yet debunking purity does not diminish heritage. Rather, it deepens appreciation for the resilience of Ghanaian identity, which has endured despite centuries of blending, showing that authenticity is not erased by integration but strengthened by survival across changing times. Myths of purity also collapse under the evidence of diaspora DNA, for descendants of enslaved Ghanaians in the Americas carry mixed ancestry shaped by coercion and survival, yet they still trace connections to Ghana, proving that identity endures even when biological lines are altered. The richness of Ghanaian DNA lies precisely in its diversity, for it captures the echoes of countless ancestors, some local, some from afar, who together built the nation's human fabric, making it impossible to separate pure from mixed without erasing the truth of history. In this way, the myth of purity is replaced by a more profound reality, that Ghana's DNA tells a story of integration, adaptation, and authenticity rooted in continuity but enriched by diversity, a story far more compelling than any illusion of untouched bloodlines. To celebrate Ghanaian heritage is therefore to embrace this complexity, to acknowledge that every Ghanaian carries within them not a single, unbroken line but a tapestry of connections that testify to centuries of resilience, survival, and unity through diversity. Part 12. Colonial Disruptions and Genetic Mixing. The onset of colonial rule brought yet another wave of transformation to Ghana's human landscape, for while the Atlantic trade had already scarred the population, European colonization added new layers of disruption that reverberated not only in politics and economy but also in the very genetic fabric of Ghana, introducing foreign elements, accelerating internal migrations, and reshaping patterns of intermarriage that left their imprint upon DNA. The establishment of British rule along the Gold Coast was accompanied by the creation of forts, missions, and administrative centers where Europeans lived, worked, and often formed unions with local women, some consensual and others coerced, producing mixed descendants whose lineages continue to carry faint European markers within Ghana's modern genome. These traces are not overwhelming, for Ghanaian DNA remains overwhelmingly African in origin, yet they stand as enduring reminders of a period when power dynamics shaped intimacy and when families were formed across boundaries of coercion and adaptation. Colonial rule also catalyzed massive internal migrations as people moved to coastal towns to work and trade, to cocoa-growing regions to seek economic opportunity, or to mining centers in search of wages, and these movements brought together groups that had once lived apart, producing marriages that further blurred ethnic boundaries and deepened genetic diversity. The cocoa boom in particular stands out as a driver of demographic change, drawing Akan families southward, farmers westward, and northern Labors into the forest belt, creating a region where DNA today reflects extraordinary diversity born of economic opportunity under colonial structures. Railways and roads built by colonial administrations accelerated this mixing, for they linked previously distant communities and encouraged mobility, ensuring that intermarriage became a widespread reality rather than an isolated exception. Education and mission schools introduced new dynamics as well. For children drawn from different ethnic groups were educated together, friendships became kinship, and marriages formed across cultural divides, embedding new threads of DNA into Ghana's human story. Colonial disruptions also introduced new forms of stratification, as families of mixed African-European descent sometimes occupied intermediary positions, navigating identities shaped by both heritage and power, and while their numbers were small, their descendants remain part of the genetic and cultural diversity of Ghana today. Yet the colonial era was not only about new additions, it also left absences, for labor migration to neighboring colonies such as Côte d'Ivoire and Nigeria drew many Ghanaians away, some never returning, creating small demographic gaps mirrored faintly in the genetic record. Wars and uprisings under colonial rule also displaced populations, scattering families and creating conditions for unexpected unions that in turn reshaped bloodlines, showing once again that disruption often produced integration. Despite the coercion and inequality of colonial relationships, Ghanaians adapted by forging new communities, blending lineages, and ensuring that survival translated into continuity. And this resilience is visible in how DNA patterns today reveal both the scars and the strength of this period. Oral traditions preserve the memory of colonial mixing, with stories of Europeans marrying into local families or of communities forming around mission compounds, and DNA evidence affirms these accounts with subtle traces of European and foreign African ancestry. For the colonial era also brought Africans from other colonies into Ghana, whether as soldiers, administrators, or workers, and their descendants added further variation to Ghana's population. Small but enduring contributions that highlight how colonial systems created new networks of human mobility. The genetic impact of this era is therefore marked not by overwhelming transformation but by subtle shifts, faint European markers, increased internal diversity, and traces of neighboring African lineages that together enriched Ghana's genetic landscape. Myths that colonialism froze identities collapse under this evidence, for even under coercion and inequality, Ghanaians continued to adapt, intermarry, and integrate, ensuring that their DNA carried forward the story of resilience rather than rupture. Colonial disruptions, though painful, became part of the authentic heritage of Ghana, for within the scars are also stories of survival, creativity, and unity through diversity, all of which remain etched in the genetic record that links past generations to the present. Part 13, Modern Science and the Mapping of Ghanaian DNA. In the 21st century, the story of Ghanaian DNA has been illuminated in new ways through modern science, as advances in genetics and genomics have made it possible to read in detail the biological record that history left scattered across bones, bloodlines, and oral traditions, and what emerges is a tapestry that confirms much of what Ghanaians have long known while also debunking myths that had been imposed from outside. Researchers studying mitochondrial DNA, which traces maternal ancestry, and Y chromosome markers, which reveal paternal lineages, have found evidence of deep continuity in Ghana's population stretching back tens of thousands of years, affirming that the peoples of this land are not recent arrivals but custodians of a homeland where humans have lived since some of the earliest chapters of human history. Genetic studies also reveal layers of migration that shape Ghana's diversity, with clear signatures linking the Akanta movements from the north. Centuries ago, the U to eastward origins, and northern groups such as the Dagomba and Gonja to ancient Sahelian networks, all of which align with oral traditions that long spoke of such journeys, showing how science and memory converge. More surprising, however, has been the discovery of subtle markers from distant regions, small genetic contributions from North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe that reflect centuries of trade, intermarriage, and colonial contact, markers that are faint but significant, revealing the openness of Ghana's population to external influences while maintaining a strong African core. These findings have also challenged myths about racial purity that were propagated during colonial times, for science shows that no population is isolated or unchanging, and that Ghana's strength lies in its genetic diversity, which has equipped communities with resilience against disease and adaptation to shifting environments. For instance, genes that provide resistance to malaria are widespread among Ghanaians, a biological adaptation to centuries of living in tropical environments where mosquitoes shape survival, and this adaptation is now being studied by medical researchers seeking to understand both its protective benefits and its links to conditions such as sickle cell disease. In this way, Ghanaian DNA has become not only a story of history but also a frontier of medical knowledge, as scientists use genetic mapping to design better treatments and public health strategies. The rise of genetic databases, built through collaborations between Ghanaian institutions and global research centers, has allowed a clearer picture of regional diversity, showing distinctions between northern and southern Ghana, between coastal and inland populations, and yet also revealing a remarkable degree of shared ancestry that underscores national unity. DNA studies have even traced the connections between Ghanaians and the African diaspora, as people of African descent in the Americas and the Caribbean often discover significant ancestral links to Ghana, affirming the painful but undeniable legacy of the transatlantic slave trade while also forging new bonds of recognition and cultural reclamation. Modern science has also helped clarify misconceptions born of colonial anthropology, which often divided people into rigid tribal categories. DNA evidence shows instead that intermarriage has long been a norm, that identities were fluid, and that cultural exchange was embedded in the very biology of Ghana's people. At the same time, ethical questions arise as genetic research expands, for while it holds the promise of understanding and empowerment, it also raises concerns about exploitation, privacy, and the misuse of data, making it crucial that Ghanaian voices guide the direction of research and ensure that discoveries serve communities rather than outside interests. Nevertheless, the broad outcome of mapping Ghanaian DNA has been one of affirmation that the oral histories of migrations are real, affirmation that the scars of slavery are visible yet survivable, affirmation that Ghanaian identity is rooted not in purity but in diversity, and affirmation that science can complement tradition in telling a fuller, richer story. Today, Ghanaian scientists are increasingly at the forefront of this work, building local capacity to conduct advanced genomics, training young researchers, and ensuring that the narrative of Ghana's DNA is told by Ghanaians themselves, in partnership with but not dependent upon foreign institutions. Through these efforts, DNA has become a bridge between past and present, between memory and evidence, and between Ghana and its global diaspora, turning science into a tool of cultural renewal and historical justice. The mapping of Ghanaian DNA is therefore not simply a matter of biology but an act of reclaiming history, a way of honoring ancestors, correcting distortions, and equipping future generations with knowledge of who they are and where they come from. Part 14. Diaspora Connections and Global Identity. The story of Ghanaian DNA does not end within the geographical borders of Ghana, for it stretches outward across oceans and continents, carried by the forced migrations of the transatlantic slave trade and later by voluntary movements that together created a vast diaspora in which millions of people share ancestral links to this West African homeland. And in recent decades, modern science has revealed these connections in striking detail, confirming oral traditions, personal suspicions, and long-silenced histories. Genetic testing companies have allowed African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and Afro-Latinos to trace their lineages back to specific regions of West Africa, with Ghana emerging repeatedly as a significant source, particularly for those whose ancestors were taken from the Gold Coast ports of Elmina, Cape Coast, and Anomabo during the height of the slave trade. For many in the diaspora, discovering Ghanaian ancestry has been more than a scientific revelation. It has been a deeply personal reconnect, a chance to heal from the ruptures of slavery by reclaiming ties to lost kin, languages, and cultures, and Ghana has embraced this process through initiatives such as the Year of Return in 2019, which invited descendants of the enslaved to visit and rediscover their roots. In these encounters, DNA is not simply a biological marker but a bridge between past suffering and present identity, allowing people to anchor themselves in a story larger than displacement. The presence of Ghanaian ancestry in the diaspora also underscores the global impact of Ghana's genetic heritage, for from the Caribbean islands to Brazil, from the United States to Europe, echoes of Akan, Ga, Yu, and northern Ghanaian peoples resonate in music, religion, food, and community structures that survived centuries of oppression. The rediscovery of these connections has enriched both Ghana and the diaspora, sparking cultural exchanges where knowledge flows in both directions, with diaspora communities relearning traditions and Ghanaians embracing the global dimension of their heritage. DNA studies have even shown how lineages once separated by slavery remain traceable, allowing people in the diaspora to identify distant relatives still living in Ghana, a profound reuniting of families across centuries. Yet diaspora identity is not monolithic. For those with Ghanaian ancestry often carry DNA from multiple African regions as well as from Europe and the Americas, reflecting the complex histories of slavery, colonization, and migration, and thus Ghana's DNA is part of a larger mosaic of African heritage that continues to evolve. This global perspective challenges myths of isolation, for Ghanaian identity is shown to be expansive and interconnected, influencing and being influenced by the world, and it demonstrates that genetics can serve as a tool for unity rather than division. The cultural consequences of this reconnect are profound, as diaspora communities have contributed to Ghana's contemporary landscape through art, investment, and return migration, while Ghanaians in turn have found pride in their role as a beacon of African heritage, celebrated worldwide. The narrative of Ghanaian DNA in the diaspora is therefore not only about loss but also about resilience, about how fragmented families and dispersed communities have preserved identity through memory, culture, and blood, and how science has now given them new ways to affirm that identity. In the modern era of globalization, these connections continue to expand, with Ghanaians living abroad forming new communities in Europe, North America, and Asia, adding yet another chapter to the genetic story, one that will shape future generations with hybrid identities grounded in Ghana but reaching outward to the world. Thus, the global identity of Ghanaian DNA is not static but dynamic, a living testament to the endurance of a people who survived rupture, adapted through diversity, and now celebrate reconnect, turning painful histories into opportunities for renewal. Through science, travel, and cultural revival, the Ghanaian genome has become a worldwide heritage, a reminder that identity is not bound by borders but carried in the blood, remembered in tradition, and shared across oceans. Part 15. Celebrating Authentic Heritage, Lessons for the Future. The journey through Ghanaian DNA reaches its most meaningful stage when it is understood not only as a biological record of the past but also as a living guide for the future, for the patterns etched into the genome of the Ghanaian people embody resilience, adaptation, and unity through diversity, offering lessons that transcend science and speak directly to heritage and identity. In celebrating this authentic history, Ghanaians are reminded that their ancestry is neither simple nor monolithic but richly woven from strands of deep-rooted origins, migrations, trade, intermarriage, disruption, and survival, a complexity that challenges myths of purity and instead honors the strength of diversity. The scars of slavery, the imprints of colonialism, and the subtle traces of contact with foreign peoples all exist within the DNA, but they are not sources of shame. They are reminders of endurance and creativity, of a people who absorb change without losing themselves, who transformed hardship into continuity, and who carried forward traditions even as their world shifted around them. In a time when global societies often seek identity in rigid categories, Ghana's genetic story teaches the opposite, that identity is strongest when it is layered, that authenticity is not found in isolation but in the embrace of history's full complexity, and that unity can be forged across differences rather than against them. the scientific revelations of recent decades. Provide tools for Ghanaians to reclaim their history on their own terms, to verify oral traditions, to correct distortions imposed by colonial anthropology, and to affirm that Ghana's place in world history is central rather than peripheral, a homeland that shaped and continues to shape the lives of millions across the globe. These lessons resonate beyond Ghana's borders, for as the diaspora reconnects through DNA testing, cultural exchange, and travel, the Ghanaian story becomes a shared inheritance that unites people once separated by oceans and centuries, offering a path of healing for communities seeking to mend the fractures of slavery. Celebrating authentic heritage also means investing in the future, ensuring that Ghanaian scientists, historians, and cultural custodians lead the way in interpreting DNA findings, protecting data, and integrating science with tradition so that the narrative remains empowering rather than exploitative. Young Ghanaians are inheriting not just the genetic code of their ancestors, but the responsibility to carry forward the lessons it contains, the importance of resilience in adversity, the value of openness to exchange, and the power of unity in diversity. As global challenges such as climate change, migration, and health crises continue to test societies, Ghana's DNA story reminds us that survival has always depended on adaptation and cooperation, and that those who thrive are those who embrace change while holding fast to identity. In cultural terms, celebrating Ghanaian DNA means honoring festivals, languages, rituals, and arts that embody the living memory of ancestry, for heritage is not locked in the past but continually renewed, and each generation adds to the fabric that future scientists and storytellers will interpret. In political terms, it means resisting divisive narratives of ethnicity or race that seek to fracture unity, remembering that the genome shows connections more than separations, and that the authentic Ghanaian identity is collective and inclusive. In spiritual terms, it means acknowledging that within every Ghanaian bloodline lies not only the echo of ancient migrations but also the unbroken link to humanity's earliest origins, for the genetic record confirms that Africa, and regions like Ghana in particular, stand near the cradle of humankind itself. Thus, Ghanaian DNA is more than a scientific curiosity. It is a living heritage, a compass pointing both backward to origins and forward to possibilities, and by embracing its lessons, Ghanaians can walk into the future with pride, knowing that their identity is rooted in one of the deepest and richest histories on Earth. The story closes, but the journey continues, for DNA is not static, and each generation adds new chapters, ensuring that the Ghanaian genome will remain a vibrant and evolving testament to a people whose past is honored, whose present is resilient, and whose future is boundless. Thank you for watching this deep exploration of Ghanaian DNA. We hope you gain new insights into heritage, resilience, and authentic history. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful narratives that connect the past to the present. Together, we celebrate truth, identity, and the human journey.